Nobody really noticed him at first. He arrived the same way every morning, quiet, unhurried, a thermos of coffee in one hand and nothing particular to prove. He wasn't a volunteer, he wasn't a donor. He was just a man in his 60s who had started showing up at a small wildlife shelter on the edge of town, asking to sit near an enclosure that most staff had quietly stopped believing in. Inside that enclosure lived a bobcat that no one could reach. It had arrived 2 years earlier, rescued from a collapsed environment, malnourished and feral-edged in the way animals get when the world has only ever shown them its worst side. The shelter had done everything right: proper nutrition, careful handling protocols, slow, patient rehabilitation attempts, and still the animal paced. Still it vanished into the back corner whenever a human approached. Still it carried that particular tension in its body, the kind that never fully uncoils, that told every experienced wildlife worker the same quiet truth: some damage runs too deep to reach. Most visitors walked past it without stopping. The veteran stopped. And then he came back the next day, and the day after that. He never tried to explain it to anyone, and nobody thought to ask, not at first. He had the kind of presence that doesn't invite questions, steady, self-contained. A man who had clearly learned, somewhere along the way, how to carry weight without advertising it. The shelter staff assumed he would lose interest within a week. That's what people did. They arrived with good intentions, encountered the reality of a traumatized animal that offered nothing back, and gradually found reasons to visit less. He didn't. He simply pulled his chair close to the fence each morning, poured his coffee and settled in. No agenda, no technique, no treats held through the chain link in an attempt to broker trust on a timeline. Just a man, sitting still, in a world that had apparently convinced him, as it had convinced the bobcat, that stillness was sometimes the only honest response left. What nobody knew yet was why he kept coming back. What nobody knew was what he had lost, how long he had been quietly disappearing inside his own home, and why this particular animal, wild, untrusting, and unreachable, had given him the one thing he hadn't felt in years: a reason to leave the house in the morning. The shelter director was the first to say something. She pulled him aside one morning, gently, professionally, and explained that the bobcat was considered a long-term non-releasable case, that the animal had shown no meaningful progress toward socialization, that the shelter's resources were stretched, and difficult decisions were being discussed quietly in staff meetings. She wasn't unkind about it. She simply wanted him to understand, before he invested any more of himself, that some animals arrive too damaged to come back from. He listened to everything she said. Then he asked if he could keep coming anyway. She said yes, mostly because she didn't have a good reason to say no. What she didn't know, what almost no one in town knew, was what his life looked like once he drove home each evening. The house that had once held a marriage, a partnership of 31 years, now held only the particular silence that follows when one person remains and the other doesn't. His wife had passed 18 months earlier. No dramatic goodbye, just a Tuesday morning that became the last one, and every morning after that carrying the strange, disorienting weight of a routine with no one left to share it. He had tried the things people suggest: staying busy, visiting family, a grief support group at the church on Elm Street that he attended twice before deciding that talking about loss in a circle of folding chairs wasn't something he could do. He wasn't broken in a way that announced itself. He was broken in the quieter way, the kind where the days still pass and the coffee still gets made and from the outside everything appears functional, while on the inside something essential has gone dim. The bobcat understood that particular kind of damage without needing it explained. Because the animal was living the same thing, not grief exactly, but the aftermath of it, the hypervigilance, the inability to trust that stillness was safe, the way it held itself apart from everything, not out of indifference but out of a wound so old it had become its entire personality. Some mornings the veteran would watch it pace and recognize something uncomfortably familiar in the pattern: the same restless circuit, the same inability to settle, the same eyes scanning a space that felt both confining and safer than whatever existed beyond it. He never said any of this aloud. He just kept showing up, kept sitting down, kept being as consistently and quietly as he knew how, simply present. And slowly, so slowly it was almost impossible to measure, the pacing began to change. It happened on a morning that looked like every other morning. No special occasion. No breakthrough moment building visibly in the days before. Just a Tuesday in late October, the air carrying that first real edge of cold, the shelter grounds quieter than usual. He arrived at his regular time, poured his coffee, and settled into the chair he had long since stopped thinking of as borrowed. The enclosure was still. The bobcat was nowhere visible, tucked into its back corner, as it often was before it heard him settle in. He didn't call to it. He never did. He simply opened his book and began to read aloud, softly, a passage about a man crossing the American plains alone, navigating by instinct and starlight. His voice was low and unhurried, the way it always was, not performing, not coaxing, just filling the air with something human that carried no demand inside it. And then the bobcat walked out, not crept, not edged forward with that low, suspicious posture it had maintained for 2 years. It walked, measured, deliberate, and crossed the length of the enclosure until it was closer to him than it had ever voluntarily been. It lowered itself to the ground. It looked at him directly with those pale, unreadable eyes, and it stayed. The volunteer who witnessed it from across the yard later said she thought she had imagined it. She stood completely still, afraid that any movement would break whatever fragile thing had just occurred. The veteran didn't move either. He kept reading. His voice didn't change pitch or speed. He gave the moment no more weight than any other moment, because somehow he understood, the way you understand certain things without being taught them, that acknowledgement would ruin it. That was the day the staff stopped calling it a lost cause. Not because the bobcat had suddenly become approachable or transformed into something it wasn't. It remained a wild animal. It always would. But there is a specific thing that happens in wildlife rehabilitation that experienced workers recognize immediately and never take for granted. The moment a traumatized animal chooses, entirely on its own terms, to close the distance, not because it has been conditioned to, not because food was involved, but because something in its nervous system has finally, quietly, decided that one particular presence in the world is safe. It had taken months. It had required nothing more than consistency, patience, and a man who had his own reasons for needing somewhere to be each morning. Neither of them had asked anything of the other. And somehow, that had been exactly enough. This is a beautifully constructed story outline. Let me analyze it deeply before writing. The outline builds to a double revelation. The crowd assumes the veteran saved the bobcat, but the veteran reframes it completely. This is a classic mirror twist structure, and it's emotionally devastating in the best way. The final physical act of the bobcat, pressing against the fence, the verbal twist with visual proof, that sequencing is perfect. Pacing signals. Celestri outline uses fragmented lines deliberately, no fear, no hesitation, no pacing, which signals a slow, breath-by-breath voiceover delivery. The script must honor that rhythm, core emotional theme. This isn't a rescue story, it's a mutual healing story. The bobcat represents the veteran's inner world, wild, untrusting, retreated, but not broken. That parallel must be woven throughout without being stated too plainly. The crowd as witness device / the fundraiser crowd serves as a surrogate for the YouTube audience. They react so the viewer feels permission to react too. This is a smart storytelling technique worth amplifying. Months have a way of quietly rewriting a person. Not in dramatic sweeps, but in small, accumulated moments that only become visible when you look back at where you started. For the veteran, those months looked unremarkable from the outside. A man in his 60s driving the same route every morning, parking in the same spot, settling into the same weathered chair outside a chain-link enclosure at a wildlife shelter most people passed without stopping. Staff would greet him, he would nod, and then the world would shrink down to just two beings, a man and a bobcat, separated by fence wire and years of different kinds of damage. People in town had opinions about it. Some admired the dedication, others quietly shook their heads. A well-meaning neighbor once told him he was wasting his golden years sitting beside an animal that would never love him back. He thanked her for the concern and drove to the shelter anyway, because by then, he wasn't going for the outcome. He had stopped waiting for the bobcat to change. He simply went because it was the one place each day where silence felt like company rather than loneliness. He read books out there, old westerns, a biography of Eisenhower. Sometimes he'd read passages aloud for no particular reason, his voice low and unhurried, floating into the enclosure like something the air just carried. Other mornings he talked, really talked, the way a man talks when he's stopped worrying about being heard. He told the bobcat about his wife, about the way she used to hum while she made coffee, about the trip to the Oregon coast they kept postponing and never took. He talked about the war without talking about the war, circling it the way men of his generation do, in references and pauses and things left deliberately incomplete. And the bobcat listened, or at least it emerged. Every single time he arrived, without fail, the animal would materialize from the back corner of the enclosure, no sound, no urgency, and settle somewhere within sight. Not close, never close at first, but present. There is a particular kind of attention that wild animals give when they have chosen, on their own terms, to trust the proximity of something. It isn't affection exactly, it's acknowledgement, and for a long time, that was enough. The shelter staff began noticing things they couldn't fully explain. The bobcat's nervous pacing, that relentless wearing circuit it had walked for years, was quieter now. On mornings the veteran arrived early. The animal was already calmer before he even sat down, as though it had learned the sound of his truck engine, the particular rhythm of his footsteps on the gravel path. One of the wildlife technicians started keeping informal notes. Reduced pacing, less reactive to ambient noise, resting more frequently during afternoon hours, clinical language for something that felt, to anyone watching closely, like the slow return of something that had been given up for lost. Then came the shelter's annual fundraising event, an open afternoon where the community walked through the facility, read the plaques, heard the stories of animals that had arrived broken, and stayed because nowhere else could take them. The forgotten bobcat was one of the featured animals that year. A small crowd gathered at the enclosure, reading the summary of how it had been found, what it had survived, why it could never return to the wild. Many of them lingered, watching the animal with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Some of them recognized the veteran. He was sitting in his usual spot, unhurried, present, a quiet fixture beside the enclosure that the bobcat had already moved toward without fanfare or fuss. A young shelter volunteer eventually crouched beside him, watching the animal for a moment, before asking the question that had been building for months in the minds of everyone who worked there. "How did you manage to save this bobcat?" The veteran didn't answer right away. He looked at the animal, really looked, the way you look at something that has given you back something you thought was gone forever. Then he said, quietly, "I didn't." The small crowd that had gathered went still. He was quiet for a moment more. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but his eyes were bright in the way eyes get when a person is holding something carefully. He told them that after his wife passed, the mornings had become the hardest part. Not the nights, the mornings. That first hour when the house was too quiet and the day stretched out ahead with no particular shape. He said there were mornings he had to talk himself into standing up, into making coffee, into having a reason. But then there was this. Every single morning there was somewhere to be. Something waiting, not for his help, not for his wisdom, but just for him, for his presence, for the particular quality of stillness he brought to a chair outside a fence. The bobcat had never needed him to fix anything. It had needed exactly what he himself had needed: patience, consistency, and someone willing to sit close without demanding anything in return. "Everyone thinks I came here to help him heal," he said. "Truth is, he helped me heal too." The enclosure was quiet. The crowd was quiet. Even the shelter's ambient sounds, the distant calls, the wind through the trees, seemed to pause. And then the bobcat stood. It crossed the enclosure slowly, without urgency, without the low-shouldered weariness that had defined its every movement for years. It walked directly toward the veteran and lowered itself to the ground, pressing the broad side of its head gently against the chain-link fence, directly beside his knee. It settled there with the exhale of an animal that has finally, after a very long time, decided that this is safe. Longtime staff members stood at the edges of the crowd, not bothering to hide what they felt, because they had worked in wildlife rehabilitation long enough to know the difference between an animal that has been conditioned and an animal that has made a choice. What they were watching was not training, it was not habit or hunger or accident, it was trust, quiet, hard-won, and absolute. Two souls, both of them marked by loss, both of them rebuilt slowly and without fanfare, sitting beside each other at the end of a long road, neither one broken anymore. People saw a lonely veteran and a forgotten bobcat. They thought one had rescued the other. But healing doesn't always happen the way we expect. Sometimes two broken souls simply sit beside each other long enough and both find hope again.